A silver typewriter, silent for decades, until it typed by itself. Welcome to the mysterious casebook. I am your host, Michael. Let's keep the mystery alive. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. It's your thoughts that make this journey so special. Now let's begin. The first sign that anything was amiss in the village of Netherbarrow came not in the form of a scream or a body, but as the rhythmic clatter of typewriter keys falling suddenly silent on a breezy May afternoon. At the edge of the village green, the ivy-twined windows of the old schoolhouse were half open, letting out the scent of tea roses and the faint echo of a mechanical staccato. And then, nothing. Inside the converted cottage, now home to the reclusive Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, the celebrated if waning writer of romantic thrillers, the silver Remington portable sat abandoned on a polished mahogany bureau. Its last line remained half-typed, the ribbon slack, the page blank beyond a single sentence. He turned the key slowly, knowing it was the last time he would. It was Miss Letitia Moffat who found her. Letitia, the village's self-appointed moral compass and president of the Netherbarrow Women's Improvement Circle, had come to deliver an invitation to the May Day Fete Planning Committee. Expecting nothing more than a tedious conversation about bunting or raffle baskets, she instead discovered Miss Pinkerton face down on the Turkish rug, her left hand clutching a page torn from her own manuscript. Dead. Quite unmistakably dead. The death, of course, caused a ripple of polite chaos through Netherbarrow. The constable was summoned, the doctor was roused from his nap, and tea was poured rather more hastily than usual in parlours up and down the village lanes. And naturally, in the corner of a sunny sitting-room with a view over St. Mildred's, churchyard Miss Jane Marple laid aside her embroidery and listened carefully as her maid Florence relayed the gossip with relish. "Poison, they say, miss," said Florence, pausing for effect. "But it don't make sense. What sort of person poisons a novelist?" Miss Marple, pale blue eyes sharp beneath her lace-trimmed cap, did not answer immediately. She simply looked out at the wavering shadows of lilac branches swaying against the garden wall. A novelist, true, but also a woman with secrets like anyone else. She had once remarked to the vicar's wife at a Sunday luncheon that she never wrote about anything she hadn't at least heard whispered over teacups. And in Netherbarrow there was no shortage of whispered things. The official line, as presented in Constable Deverell's sputtering afternoon statement at the village green, was that Miss Pinkerton had died of heart failure, possibly complicated by a stimulant. He fumbled over the word stimulant, like a man unsure of whether it referred to a pill or an indecent rumour. But Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know that hearts did not fail without reason, and that the deadliest poisons were rarely found in locked cabinets, reserved her opinion. She accepted Florence's offering of scones, nodded at the clock, 4:15 exactly, and allowed herself a single thoughtful comment. "It is an odd thing, Florence," she murmured, "but I always say that when a writer stops writing, in the middle of a sentence something unnatural must have intervened." Florence blinked. "Unnatural, miss." Miss Marple only smiled and reached for her knitting. Later that evening, under the apricot hues of dusk, the village of Netherbarrow seemed eerily still. The shops had closed early, and even the raucous lads who typically loitered near the baker's were nowhere to be seen. At the pub, the Wren and Pheasant, talk was hushed and speculative. "She never had enemies," insisted Mr. Toller, the butcher, whose daughter had once played a housemaid in one of Miss Pinkerton's short-lived stage adaptations. "Rubbish," muttered Mrs. Godfrey, who rented the upstairs flat above the post office and held strong views about everyone. She hated that niece of hers. Kept her like a caged bird, she did, poor girl. "Didn't she have a gentleman visitor last month?" asked Mrs. Biddle, who kept a telescope in her window under the guise of bird-watching. "A stranger in a dark coat. Arrived at dusk. Left before breakfast." "Oh, she had visitors, all right," said Mr. Toller darkly, "but not friends." And so the chorus of suspicion began, low, slow, and utterly unreliable. Theories bloomed. In hedgerows, were pruned in front gardens and bloomed again at the grocer's queue. It was murder, no, an accident, a suicide. But then why the missing page from her manuscript? Why the silver typewriter, freshly cleaned, and yet missing its ribbon spool? Why the faint scent of bitter almonds in a room that held no food? Miss Marple did not gossip, not aloud, but she observed the subtle tremble in Mrs. Godfrey's voice when she mentioned the niece, noticed the hard gleam in Mr. Toller's eyes, watched the tight smile of the vicar's wife as she passed Miss Pinkerton's garden, now unkempt and wilting in the evening sun. Most of all, Miss Marple remembered a very curious conversation she'd had with Lavinia Pinkerton some 6 weeks prior at the library, when the writer had dropped a book of poison trials in the returns bin. "Purely research, you understand," Lavinia had said with a mischievous smile. "One must stay fresh for the readers. I'm doing something new, something rather dark." She had not seemed afraid then. But now, with her last sentence unfinished, and a silver typewriter standing silent in a room that reeked faintly of almonds, Miss Marple wondered if perhaps her research had indeed taken a darker turn than she had ever intended. The Fate Committee, of course, still met, as it always did, but the bunting felt absurdly bright that year, and in the quiet corner of the drawing-room where Miss Marple resumed her embroidery, the pattern she stitched began to shift from forget-me-nots to foxgloves, a flower beautiful, and terribly poisonous. By the following morning, Netherbarrow had become a village of hushed voices and watchful glances. The bells of St. Mildred's rang out their usual 8:30 chime, but even they seemed to carry a different tone, as if sounding over a place now uncertain of its own peace. The death of Miss Lavinia Pinkerton had not yet been formally declared a murder, but no one in the village needed official confirmation to believe that something unnatural had occurred. Outside the grocer's, Mrs. Dunleavy was examining plums with unnecessary scrutiny, while casting sidelong glances toward Mr. Archibald Lane, the retired solicitor, who had appeared 5 minutes earlier in an unusually crumpled coat. "I heard she'd just finished a will," Mrs. Dunleavy murmured, to Mrs. Beavis, the postmistress, who was supposedly sorting change but clearly eavesdropping. "Left everything to that niece of hers. What's her name again? Eleanor? Elaine?" "Elspeth," said Mrs. Beavis crisply, though I'm not sure she ever called her aunt anything other than Miss Pinkerton. Very modern, these girls. "No respect. Or perhaps no affection," Mrs. Dunleavy replied with raised eyebrows. "You can't fake that. I always say you can tell a lot about a woman by how her young relations treat her funeral arrangements." "She's not even buried yet," Mrs. Beavis whispered, "and I hear Elspeth's already taken the framed publicity photo off the parlour mantel and replaced it with an abstract oil painting, something blue and swirly." Mrs. Dunleavy pursed her lips. "Disrespectful." Across the green, Constable Deverell was speaking to Reverend Drayton in the shadow of the War Memorial. The constable, a well-meaning man in his 40s, with a thick moustache and a weakness for ecclesiastical authority, looked as though he were trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. "No signs of forced entry," Deverell was saying, rubbing the back of his neck. "No bruising, no wound, nothing to suggest violence. But the doctor, well, he says the expression on her face was disturbed, said her jaw was clenched, which isn't normal in a peaceful death. And there's that smell, bitter almonds, cyanide." "Possibly," the Reverend asked gently, glancing toward the schoolhouse, its windows now shuttered. "So the doctor thinks. He's sending for the county pathologist, but it'll take a few days. They're backed up in Y." Miss Marple, walking unhurriedly along the edge of the green with her shopping basket balanced neatly on her arm, slowed her step just enough to overhear. She didn't break stride, nor did she appear to eavesdrop, but every word embedded itself neatly into her mind. She paused at the bakery to buy a half loaf of barley bread and exchange pleasantries with young Timothy March, who had only recently returned from London after what his mother vaguely described as a professional disappointment. "It's strange, Miss Marple," Timothy said as he wrapped the bread in wax paper. "She was writing again, you know. Miss Pinkerton, I mean. Something new. Kept telling people it would change the direction of her career. Some kind of literary reinvention." "Yes, Florence mentioned something of the sort," Miss Marple said with mild interest. "Did she say what inspired her?" "No, but she asked me about crime reports a few weeks ago. Wanted to know if the local paper ever ran pieces about missing persons, particularly ones that went unsolved." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, accepting her parcel with a smile. Perhaps she was plotting a disappearance rather than a murder. Timothy laughed, but the sound was hollow. Or perhaps she was afraid she'd be the one to disappear. A gentle breeze stirred the lace curtain in the window behind him, and Miss Marple, ever sensitive to symbols and small shifts in tone, made a mental note of the boy's comment. He had always been a bright child, perhaps too bright for Nether, Barrow's slower rhythms. She'd once caught him as a schoolboy scribbling notes in the margins of a hymnal, calculations of some sort. Ciphered poetry, he had claimed. The rest of the morning unfurled slowly, filled with casual questions and careful listening. At the Women's Improvement Circle meeting in the parish hall, the conversation, meant to focus on rose-cutting techniques and bunting schedules, quickly drifted into darker territory. "I simply can't believe it," declared Mrs. Edgecombe, who had read every one of Lavinia Pinkerton's novels and styled her hair to match the dust jacket photo. She was in perfect health, and she didn't take sugar, you know, not in her tea, not in anything. Too clever for that. "And what does sugar have to do with it?" asked Miss Moffat suspiciously, who had found the body and still relished the attention it brought. "Cyanide," Mrs. Edgecombe whispered. "That's how it's usually disguised. In sugar or sweet wine. I read it in Murder at the Belladonna. Club?" "Oh, really, Edith," said Mrs. Gaskell, who prided herself on more rational sensibilities. "You make it sound like we live in a penny dreadful. This is Nether Barrow, not Whitechapel." Miss Marple remained silent during the entire exchange, knitting needles gently clicking, eyes never straying from her pattern. But she was taking note, not of the content so much as the manner in which it was delivered. Mrs. Edgecombe's relish, Miss Moffat's vanity, Mrs. Gaskell's carefully placed disbelief. And Elspeth, the niece who had arrived halfway through, Anne sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, saying very little. Elspeth Pinkerton was a curious figure in the village. She had arrived 3 years ago from Brighton, ostensibly to assist her aunt, but in practice did little more than manage appointments and prepare bland casseroles. Her hair was too flat, her eyes too sharp, and her clothing too modern for Nether Barrow's aesthetic tastes. But it was the way she watched the others that intrigued Miss Marple, like a cat among pigeons, never fluttering herself, but always ready to pounce. When the meeting ended, Miss Marple lingered by the coat, racked just long enough to hear Elspeth speak quietly to Mrs. Gaskell. She was working on something new, you know. Said it would stir things up. Mrs. Gaskell made a non-committal noise. Writers say that sort of thing all the time. No, Elspeth said flatly. She meant here, in the village. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicarage. She did not announce her suspicions, nor offer opinions. Instead, she delivered a pot of quince jelly and listened as Mrs. Drayton complained about the slow post, and how nothing ever arrived on time anymore. "Oh," she added casually, "and that dreadful business with Lavinia Pinkerton. The worst part is, I loaned her my brass letter opener months ago, and now I shall never see it again." "Did she keep her correspondence in the bureau drawer?" Miss Marple asked softly. "I suppose she did. But the constable's sealed off the house, hasn't he?" "Terribly thorough, that man." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, quite." Back home, as twilight descended, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the flickering lights of the old schoolhouse. Across the green, a single constable stood watch at the front gate, but inside the house lay the real clues, somewhere between the unfinished sentence on the typewriter and the missing page clutched in the dead woman's hand. And if Miss Marple knew anything about human nature, and she did, it was this: no one ever writes a final sentence they don't mean to finish. Not unless they are stopped. Tomorrow she would visit the niece, and she would ask just the sort of gentle, irrelevant questions that often led to the truth. The following morning dawned clear and golden, casting long shafts of early light across the dew-touched green. In Nether Barrow, the air smelled faintly of lilac and newly turned earth, but the cheer of the spring morning could not quite reach the shadow cast by the recent tragedy. Curtains remained drawn longer than usual. Conversations were clipped and cautious, and the silence around the old schoolhouse had grown weightier by the hour. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Marple, in a prim dove-grey coat and a modest hat, trimmed with forget-me-nots, set out toward the Pinkerton home. She walked with deliberate care, her small figure hardly noticeable against the white picket fences and flower beds bursting into bloom. A pair of robins fluttered above the hedgerows, and the postman nodded politely as he passed, but Miss Marple did not pause. She was thinking about page margins. Specifically, the narrow ones Lavinia Pinkerton had always preferred, something she had once remarked upon during a library conversation. There's a kind of menace, I think, in the tension between a cramped margin and a loaded sentence. The old schoolhouse loomed as she approached, its brickwork softened by age, its ivy coiled like green lace across the gables. A uniformed constable, the same young man from the previous day, straightened as she arrived. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said awkwardly. I'm afraid no visitors inside at the moment." "I understand entirely," Miss Marple said with a pleasant smile. "I came only to see Miss Elspeth Pinkerton. Perhaps in the garden?" The constable hesitated. "She's taken to the sunroom this morning, actually. said she couldn't bear to sit upstairs with everything as it was. Miss Marple gave a soft, grandmotherly sigh. Grief does express itself in peculiar ways. Might I sit with her for a few minutes, purely to offer my condolences? I knew her aunt well. The constable blinked uncertainly. Well, I suppose if you stay on the ground floor, the inspector will be by after lunch and he won't want people disturbing the scene upstairs. Quite right. I shan't go near the stairs. With this reluctant permission, Miss Marple stepped inside the house. The air within was stale, carrying the ghost of something acrid and faintly sweet, an unpleasant tang that still lingered near the walls and window panes. The entry hall had been tidied, though dust clung defiantly to the corners, and a pair of black gloves lay forgotten on a side table, one of them inside out. Elspeth Pinkerton was seated in the sunroom, her frame half-shadowed by the curling fronds of a potted palm. She was dressed in pale green, a tone too light for morning and too bold for invisibility. Her face, though smooth and elegant, bore signs of sleeplessness. There were dark hollows under her eyes, and a brittle tightness around the mouth that hinted at either shock or restraint. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, "I wasn't expecting company." "I never presume to intrude," Miss Marple said gently, "but I did want to offer my sympathy. I know this must be a dreadful time for you." Elspeth gave a small nod, her eyes drifting to the garden just beyond the sunroom's glass. "It's strange. I keep expecting her to call down for tea. She was very particular about the hour. 4 o'clock always, not a minute before. Routine can be a comforting thing, even when imposed by someone else," Miss Marple said. "I'm sure you'll feel the loss of her habits as keenly as the loss of her company." There was a flicker in Elspeth's expression, perhaps agreement or perhaps something harder to define. "She could be very controlling," Elspeth said after a moment. "That's not unkind, just factual. I came here to help her, but it never quite felt like I belonged in the house. It was always hers." "Did she speak to you about her new manuscript?" Miss Marple asked, her tone still light and conversational. "Florence mentioned she'd been typing furiously these past weeks." Elspeth hesitated. "She didn't let me read it, not even a page. She said it was something entirely different, something provocative. I didn't press, I'd learned not to." "But you must have been curious." "Of course I was, but Aunt Lavinia enjoyed her secrets, especially when they gave her power. I'm sure whatever she was writing, it wasn't just fiction." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her mind. "It's possible," she said gently, "that someone didn't want that manuscript finished." Elspeth turned toward her, startled. "You think she was killed?" Miss Marple offered a small, unreadable smile. "I think people often underestimate the motives that can lurk beneath domestic respectability. What was the last thing your aunt said to you?" Elspeth blinked. "She asked me to bring her a cup of tea around 3. I made it and left it in the study. She told me not to interrupt her. I didn't see her again until Miss Moffat came screaming from the hallway." "And the tea?" Miss Marple asked delicately. "I made it just as she liked, no sugar, half a spoon of Darjeeling with a twist of lemon. I do it the same every day. It's second nature by now." There was something a little too rehearsed about the answer, Miss Marple thought, though she nodded kindly. "You mentioned your aunt had secrets. Did she ever suggest what sort of secrets they were?" Elspeth looked away. "Only that they involved people we both knew. She said I'd be better off not knowing, that I still had a future." "And do you feel that way now?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward slightly. Elspeth's jaw tightened. I feel free in a way, but frightened too. If someone did kill her, I don't know whether it was because of the manuscript or because of something else entirely. And that's what terrifies me." They sat in silence for a moment, the shadows of leaves dancing across the sunroom walls. Then Elspeth stood abruptly. "I need to go into town this afternoon. I have to speak to the solicitor. I suppose it all falls to me now." "So it does," Miss Marple said, rising. "And while you're out, you might consider returning your aunt's brass letter-opener to Mrs. Drayton at the vicarage. She mentioned it quite wistfully yesterday." Elspeth blinked, genuinely confused. "But I haven't seen it in weeks." "No?" Miss Marple smiled. "Strange. I was under the impression your aunt used it often for her correspondence. I imagine it will turn up eventually." As she turned to go, Miss Marple cast one final glance into the hall. The door to the study remained closed, its lock freshly fitted by the constable. But something caught her eye. A small slip of paper on the floor just under the edge of the skirting board near the base of the umbrella stand. She made a mental note of its placement and said nothing. Once outside, she paused to tighten her scarf against a rising wind. The sky was clouding over, soft and pale, and the air had lost some of its spring warmth. Elspeth Pinkerton was not a woman Miss Marple trusted, but neither was she, Miss Marple suspected, the sort of woman who would make tea carelessly. That, in itself, was revealing. And if Lavinia Pinkerton had truly been writing about someone in the village, someone real, then her manuscript might still exist. Hidden, perhaps, or taken. Either way, the answer to her death lay in that unfinished story, not the one on the page, but the one that had never been told. Miss Marple had always believed that truth was like a thread stitched carelessly into a hem, meant to remain hidden, but always tugging loose when you least expected. And now it was time to find the thread. By the time the church clock struck 1, the clouds had settled into a dense overcast above Nether Barrow, giving the afternoon a muted grey hush. It was the kind of weather that quieted even the birds and made every footstep seem louder than it ought. Miss Marple, seated in her parlour with a fresh cup of tea and her lap blanketed in wool, was not knitting today. The needles sat still beside her on the table. Instead, she held a small notebook, bound in leather the colour of old tobacco, and a stub of pencil, with which she had begun to draw a faint map of the old schoolhouse's interior from memory. She was marking details, the layout of the study, the positioning of the typewriter and desk, the window that looked out over the lane. The carpet, Turkish and red gold, slightly frayed at the edges. It was an unusual room for writing fiction, she thought, a bit too formal, a bit too exposed. But Miss Pinkerton had always taken herself rather seriously as a writer. One didn't write stories in one's bedroom, one composed. Miss Marple drew a small circle where she had seen the umbrella stand, and a dot beside it, the scrap of paper she had noticed half hidden beneath the skirting board. It might be nothing, or it might be everything. At 1:15, a gentle knock came at her front door. She rose slowly, smoothing her skirt, and opened it to find none other than Timothy March, the baker's son, shifting his weight anxiously from foot to foot. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a nervous smile. "Hope I'm not intruding. I was just on delivery round, and I wondered, may I have a word?" "Of course, Timothy," she said, ushering him in. "Do come in. There's fresh lemon sponge if you care for a slice." He declined with a polite shake of the head, and took a seat by the fireplace, his fingers drumming on his knee. Miss Marple observed this little detail with interest, a restless habit, the sort that usually suggested the presence of something unsaid. "It's about Miss Pinkerton," Timothy said at last. "Or rather, about something I saw." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly in her lap. "Go on, dear." "Well, you remember I mentioned she came by the bakery a few weeks ago, asking about missing persons?" "Yes, I recall." "Curious for a romantic novelist." "Exactly, that's what struck me. And then 2 days before she died, she returned. She asked me if I knew where she could find a typewriter repairman. She said her machine had been acting oddly, skipping letters, she said, and she was terribly upset that day, flustered, like she'd seen something she shouldn't have." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "And did she mention what it was?" Timothy shook his head. "Only that her new manuscript was dangerous. Real names, real motives," she muttered. Then she caught herself and laughed. "Said she was being melodramatic. Did anyone else hear this?" "No one else was in the shop, but—" He hesitated. "That afternoon I saw her niece walking across the green with a bundle under her arm. A sheaf of papers, I think. She was heading toward the post office." "That would be Miss Beavis's territory," Miss Marple murmured. "And what time was this?" "Close to 4, I'd say." "Curious," said Miss Marple softly. "That would be just after the tea Elspeth prepared for her aunt." Timothy looked troubled. "Do you think she might have stolen the manuscript?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that several people may have wanted to. Whether she succeeded is another matter." After Timothy had gone, Miss Marple placed a thoughtful call to Miss Beavis at the post office, inquiring, in the most offhand way imaginable, whether there had been any large parcels posted the day before Miss Pinkerton's death. "Well," said Miss Beavis, her voice crackling slightly through the telephone, "now that you mention it, yes. Elspeth brought in a brown envelope stiff with pages. No return address. Said it was literary material being sent for storage. Odd thing to post on a Thursday." "And was it local?" "Oh, no. It was addressed to a solicitor's office in London, Thornbury and Cates, if I remember correctly." "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said with genuine cheer. "You've been terribly helpful." By 4 o'clock, Miss Marple had arranged for tea with Inspector Cray at the Wren and Pheasant. Cray was not an imaginative man, blunt, stocky, and fond of plain biscuits, but he respected Miss Marple in the way men of his profession often respect those who manage to find answers without ever stepping into a police station. "You believe it was poison, then?" Miss Marple asked gently, as the inspector stirred a lump of sugar into his tea. "Cyanide. Likely. We're awaiting the county pathologist's final analysis. Pinkerton had a faint blue tint under her nails, and the smell unmistakable if you know what you're sniffing for. And yet," Miss Marple said, "no teacup was recovered." Cray looked up sharply. "That's just it. The tray was there, the teapot, the milk, but no cup. We assumed it had been cleared away, but Elspeth swore she left one. And no residue in the pot? Clean as a whistle, we checked, which suggests the poison didn't come from there." "Indeed," Miss Marple mused. "Have you examined the typewriter?" Cray's brow furrowed. "The typewriter." The sentence she was in the middle of typing. He turned the key slowly, knowing it was the last time he would, and then nothing. "Most inconvenient, don't you think?" Cray rubbed his chin. "We did note that, but we assumed she simply died mid-sentence." "But that's just the thing," said Miss Marple. "Writers don't stop mid-sentence, they stop at chapter breaks, or after a dramatic full stop. To abandon a sentence mid-thought, it suggests interruption, either from sudden death or something more deliberate." Cray was watching her now with renewed attention. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Suppose someone wanted to make it look like she died in the middle of her work. So they staged the scene, even removed the original page from the typewriter and replaced it with a false one. It wouldn't take long to type a few words, would it? Cray considered this. "You're suggesting the last line may not be hers." "I'm suggesting it doesn't feel like hers. Not if she believed what she was writing was dangerous." 1. Does not type "he turned the key slowly" in the middle of a confession about real people. It sounds more like her earlier fiction, perhaps a page from a different draft, or perhaps planted to buy time. Cray's eyes narrowed. "Which means the real page might still be missing." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Or it might be in London already, with the firm of Thornbury and Cates." The inspector whistled. "Well, I'll be— And if you don't mind," she added gently, "I'd like to borrow that missing page the doctor found in her hand, the one torn from the manuscript. Just a glance, of course. I'll have it sent round. As and tea." They parted. Miss Marple stepped out into the wind, her coat fluttering behind her. Her mind was already ticking, fitting pieces together, not just of murder, but of character. Elspeth's poised silence, the missing teacup, the misleading sentence, the posted manuscript. Someone had tried to delay discovery. But they'd forgotten that words, like crimes, leave a trail, even when the ink dries invisible. She would find the true sentence, and when she did, the rest of the story would begin to write itself. The torn page arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, just before twilight, carefully folded into a cream envelope, and delivered by a fidgeting young constable who mumbled an apology for the delay and promptly hurried away as if the note might catch fire in his hands. Miss Marple, ever gracious, thanked him, and carried the envelope to her sitting room, as though it were a letter from a long-lost friend. She didn't open it at once. Instead, she brewed a fresh pot of tea, laid out 2 ginger biscuits, and adjusted the cushion on her armchair. Then, with the kind of deliberate calm she had cultivated over decades of quiet observation, she slipped the page free and held it up to the lamp. The first thing she noticed was the handwriting. Lavinia Pinkerton's, unmistakable slanted script, neatly formed but slightly uneven, as though written in haste or agitation. The second was the paper itself, not the pale cream she used for her drafts, but a sharper ivory stock, heavier, more expensive. A new notepad, perhaps, or one borrowed in urgency. The content was only a paragraph long, but it was dense with suggestion. There. Here's a difference between invention and revelation. I have invented many stories over the years, but only once have I told the truth. The trouble is, truth is far less welcome. Truth stains. It lingers in a room long after you've left. And I fear the person I've written about knows exactly what I've done. They know the shape of their guilt, and if I am found before this reaches print, let it be understood, there is nothing fictional about what I have named. No names, no dates, just a kind of written confession, a message pressed between fiction and fact, a warning, perhaps a last attempt at self-preservation. Miss Marple placed the page beside her on the table, folded her hands, and sat back in her chair, listening to the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of wind against the cottage panes. She had no doubt now. Lavinia Pinkerton had been murdered, poisoned deliberately, and with the cold assurance of someone who knew they would not be suspected. Someone who had read the real manuscript, perhaps only in part, perhaps merely hinted at, and realized that their name or their deeds might soon be exposed in print, and not cloaked behind fictional pseudonyms or romantic metaphors, but revealed for what they truly were. At 9 the next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the village library, a modest brick building wedged between the post office and the parish clerk's office. Inside it smelled of old paper, beeswax, and the faintest trace of chalk. Mrs. Chilvers, the librarian, was restocking the shelf marked Light Crime and Suspense. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said cheerfully, "come, to pick up the gardening guide again?" "Not today," Miss Marple smiled. "I wondered if you still had a copy of Miss Pinkerton's first novel, The Ashwood Confession?" Mrs. Chilvers looked momentarily surprised. "I should think so. Nobody ever checks it out, to be honest. Her later books were much more popular. That one's awfully slow." "All the better," Miss Marple said gently. "I find the slow ones tend to be the most revealing." The book was located quickly. A faded blue hardback with a cracked spine and yellowing pages. Miss Marple signed it out, tucked it beneath her arm, and left with a nod of thanks. She did not return home immediately, but walked instead toward the churchyard, where the wrought-iron benches offered a quiet place to read. There, beneath the arching shadow of a yew tree, she began to scan the pages. The Ashwood Confession had never been a commercial success. Too bleak, too introspective, and lacking the romantic entanglements that had later defined Miss Pinkerton's style. But as Miss Marple read, she began to see something different. Characters that felt too real, dialogue that echoed tones she had heard around the village green. There was a solicitor with a fondness for whiskey and a knack for losing documents. A baker's son whose keen intelligence was hidden beneath apparent mediocrity. A woman described only as E.P., who lived in the shadow of another's ambition. Could it be that Lavinia had been writing about Nether Barrow all along, veiled in fiction, and if so, what made the final manuscript so dangerous? The answer came that afternoon, in the form of a quiet visit from Inspector Cray. He arrived unannounced at Miss Marple's cottage, his coat speckled with mist and a brown envelope tucked under one arm. "We received confirmation from the solicitor in London," he said, as she poured him a cup of tea. "A parcel arrived the morning after Miss Pinkerton's death, 30 pages typed, titled Ashwood Revisited, marked Confidential Literary Estate. The firm had been instructed not to open it unless she failed to attend her meeting on Monday. When she didn't arrive, they contacted us." "And the contents?" Miss Marple asked softly. Cray looked grim. "Half fiction, half accusation. She names names this time. Not just village gossip. Serious implications. Fraud, coercion, and one instance that could well be blackmail. And who, if I may ask, features in these accusations?" Cray hesitated, then opened the envelope. From it, he drew several typed pages and slid one across the table. "This one you'll recognize." Miss Marple scanned the page. It was an early chapter, centered around a village fete where a local benefactor, a retired solicitor with declining memory, misplaces a legal document connected to a will, only for the contents to be changed, mysteriously in the days before the testator's death. "Archibald Lane," Miss Marple murmured. Of course. Except it's not just fiction, Cray said. The real Archibald Lane did witness Miss Pinkerton's will revisions last year, and according to the manuscript, he had been pressured into overlooking a key clause. A clause that altered the inheritance in Elspeth's favour. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Which would give Elspeth motive not only to speed up the inheritance, but to silence the author. But it gets more tangled, Cray continued. Lane isn't the only one named. There's a reference to a financial irregularity involving the Women's Improvement Circle Fund, an accusation of identity fabrication concerning the baker's son, Timothy March, and something vague but disturbing about the vicar's wife and a woman who vanished in Brighton. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. She wasn't writing fiction at all. She was writing retribution. Cray nodded. And someone decided to stop the story before it ended. Miss Marple stood and crossed to the window, gazing out at the grey-green fields and the faint spire of the church beyond. The final sentence, the one in the typewriter, it wasn't hers. It was someone else's idea of what her fiction should have looked like. Safe, harmless. She turned. But truth, Inspector, truth never finishes mid-sentence. He looked at her curiously. And what do you intend to do next, Miss Marple? She smiled gently, folding her hands before her. Why? Nothing dramatic. I shall pay. A call on Archibald Lane, and perhaps take tea with Elspeth. It's remarkable what people say when they believe they've won. The Lane residence, though modest in size, bore all the affectations of a man clinging to past authority. The brass nameplate on the gate still read, Archibald Lane Esquiant, retired solicitor, though his practice had officially closed 5 years prior. The rose bushes lining the front walk had grown unruly, sprawling over the garden path like neglected legal files, and the paint on the window-sills had begun to blister beneath the spring damp. But the curtains were always crisply drawn, and the brass knocker on the green front door shone bright as ever, a testament to Mrs. Lane's persistence with polish, if not her husband's with propriety. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 3:30. She had written in advance, as manners dictated, requesting a few minutes of Mr. Lane's time regarding certain community matters. The reply, on thick cream-coloured stationery in a trembling but legible script, invited her for tea. She was shown in by Mrs. Lane, a wiry woman with sharp eyes and a tight-lipped smile that never quite softened into warmth. The drawing-room where she left Miss Marple to wait was a museum of legal memorabilia. Ink blotters, brass scales, old law books with faded spines, and a cracked leather briefcase that seemed permanently slouched beside the armchair. When Archibald Lane finally entered, he did so with the slow precision of a man who believed movement should not be wasted. He wore a charcoal grey suit that sagged slightly at the shoulders, and his once imposing frame had diminished into something more stooped and hesitant. But his eyes, though rimmed with age, held a glint of the barrister he had once been. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with a dry cough, extending a mottled hand. "A pleasure. I trust you're not here to dispute my wife's lemon sponge, though I'll confess it's more mortar than cake these days." "I would never commit libel against a hostess," Miss Marple replied with a smile, taking the offered seat. "But I do appreciate your time. It's not legal advice I seek, I assure you, merely clarification." "Clarification." Lane lowered himself into the opposite chair and reached for a cup. "My dear woman, you make me sound like a suspect. Miss Marple folded her hands delicately. "I've found over the years that people rarely suspect themselves, Mr. Lane. It's one of life's ironies." Lane chuckled, a sound more weary than amused. "You've come about Lavinia." "I have." He stirred his tea with exaggerated care. "She was a formidable woman, always dramatizing things, but clever. Too clever, perhaps. You witnessed her final will, did you not?" "I did, and I regret it." His voice hardened slightly. "Not because of the contents, but because I no longer trust the circumstances. The document was brought to me by Elspeth, hurriedly typed, unsigned. She claimed her aunt was unwell and requested it be formalized the next day. Lavinia signed it in my presence, but she didn't seem entirely aware of what she was doing." Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. "And yet you attested to her mental clarity." Lane looked away. "I did. I've been ashamed of that ever since. There was pressure. Not from Elspeth directly, no. But there was a sense, an urgency. I thought it was just an eccentric whim. Now I wonder. Do you recall what changed in the new will?" He nodded. "The original left a portion to several literary charities, a scholarship for young writers, a fund for the village library, even a donation to a retirement home for actors. The new will redirected nearly everything to Elspeth." "A dramatic shift," Miss Marple murmured. "Lavinia said she'd grown. Disillusioned with institutions," Lane muttered. "Said the charities would squander her legacy, but she didn't speak like herself. There was something strange about her that day. Flat, almost rehearsed." Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. "And do you believe she was coerced?" "I do now. But I lacked the courage to question it then." His mouth trembled faintly. "If she'd sent that manuscript to print, I think it would have destroyed more reputations than just Elspeth's." "You were named." He gave a bitter smile. "Thin-veiled terms, yes. She knew I'd been negligent. She knew I'd chosen comfort over principle. And I imagine she wanted to give me one final chance to correct the record." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Sometimes a truth told in fiction is more dangerous than one confessed in court." Lane looked up sharply. "You believe it was murder, don't you?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that she intended to make her final work a mirror, and that someone who saw their reflection in it found the image too unflattering to allow." There was a long pause. The mantel clock ticked steadily. Outside, a blackbird sang from the hedge. Finally, Lane spoke again, voice low. "You should know something else. The will she signed, the one I witnessed, had a second page. A codicil." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "It was never attached," Lane said. "Elspeth returned a few days later to collect the draft and claimed the final version was being kept safe. But I never saw the second page again. It made one critical amendment. It instructed that the estate should be held in trust for Elspeth, with portions diverted upon confirmation of Lavinia's new manuscript being published without alteration." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, her mind quickening. "So Elspeth would only inherit if she allowed the truth to be printed." Lane nodded. "And that codicil is now missing. It was signed and witnessed. It had equal legal weight. But without it, the rest of the will appears straightforward." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Lane. You've given me much to consider." He didn't rise to see her out. "You'll need proof," he said behind her. "No one will believe this without proof." "No," Miss Marple agreed, pausing at the door. "But I believe Lavinia left a trail. The question is, did someone else find it first? As she stepped back into the grey afternoon, Miss Marple felt the wind shift slightly, carrying the scent of hyacinths and wood smoke. The solicitor's confession had cast new light over everything. If the codicil had vanished, it was likely stolen. And if it was stolen, it had to be by someone who knew it was critical. Someone close enough to Lavinia to know her habits. Someone who understood the weight of a second page. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and made a list in her notebook. The missing teacup. The faked final sentence. The revised will, and its hidden codicil. The manuscript already posted. The page Lavinia clutched in death. Each clue pointed in the same direction, not outward, but inward. Toward the house, toward Elspeth. But there was still something missing. One final link between motive and method. And Miss Marple, who had never trusted coincidence, resolved to find it before another truth was buried. The next morning dawned, cool and bright, with the pale blue clarity that only followed a night of heavy rain. Nether Barrow's streets, still damp, gleamed in the morning sun, and the hedgerows sparkled faintly with lingering dew. Life appeared to resume its gentle course. Milk bottles clinked against front steps. The butcher swept yesterday's leaves from his threshold, and schoolchildren scuffed through puddles on their way to lessons. Yet, underneath the routine, the village hummed with a quiet tension, as if every daffodil and teacup held its breath for the next turn of events. Miss Marple, clad in her soft grey shawl and carrying a small embroidered handbag, set off after breakfast with her usual modest stride. But her direction today was deliberate. The post office, nestled between the ironmonger's and the milliner's shop, the Nether Barrow post office was a tidy little structure, painted pale mint, with white trim and a front window adorned with curled announcements and faded charity posters. Inside, the scent of paper, twine, and lavender furniture polish lingered. Miss Beavis, the long-serving postmistress, stood behind the high wooden counter in her sensible cardigan, spectacles perched near the end of her nose, counting out stamps with the same solemnity a vicar might assign to communion wafers. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she chirped, only half looking up. "Still no reply to your letter to Mr. Curtis in Little Dodding, I'm afraid. Post is frightful these days." "No trouble at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, stepping up to the counter. "Though today I find myself wondering, not about replies but departures." Miss Beavis blinked and looked up. "Departures. I recall you mentioning last week that Elspeth Pinkerton brought in a parcel to be posted the day before her aunt's unfortunate passing." Miss Beavis straightened, sensing something beneath the surface of the inquiry. "Yes, brown paper, large envelopes sealed with tape. She said it was literary, going to a firm in London. Thornbury and Cates, wasn't it?" "That's right. They received plenty from her aunt. Publishers, I suppose." "Did you notice anything unusual about the package?" Beavis hesitated. "It wasn't heavy, just stiff. But now that you mention it, she seemed nervous, rushed even, asked for a receipt, which she never used to do." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers resting gently against her handbag clasp. "Did she ask to insure it?" "No," Beavis said slowly. "But she paid for expedited delivery, registered post. She was very clear that it must arrive the next day." "I wonder," Miss Marple said, turning to glance at the modest interior of the post office. "Do you recall what time she arrived?" "Oh, quite precisely. 3:30. I just finished balancing the morning drawer. And no one else was in the shop at that time. Miss Beavis frowned. Actually, now that you ask, young Sarah Parsons came in just after Elspeth left. She helps part-time at the vicarage and was picking up a telegram. Would it be possible to speak to her? Beavis tilted her head. I imagine so. She's working at the vicarage this week, arranging the hymnals for Candle Sunday. Miss Marple offered a warm smile. Then I shall take a gentle walk to St. Mildred's. Thank you, Miss Beavis. The vicarage stood peacefully at the edge of the village green, its stone facade shaded by a chestnut tree whose leaves fluttered in the breeze like cautious hands. Sarah Parsons answered the door herself, a slender girl of about 16 with sandy hair, pale brows, and a perpetually serious expression. Yes, Miss Marple. She asked somewhat shyly, Just a moment of your time, dear. I believe you visited the post office last Thursday. Yes, ma'am. I was collecting a telegram for Reverend Drayton. Do you remember seeing Miss Pinkerton's niece there? Sarah nodded. Yes, she was just leaving as I entered. She nearly bumped into me at the door, looked rather flustered. Did she say anything to you? Only excuse me, though she seemed to hesitate for a second as if she were about to say something more. Then she left in a hurry, clutching her handbag tightly. Miss Marple's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. And did you see what she posted? No, ma'am, but Miss Beavis was still stamping something as I approached the counter. It looked like a manuscript, the kind you see tied with string, but it had already been sealed in the brown envelope. Miss Marple thanked the girl with genuine warmth and turned back toward the green. She walked slowly, mulling over every word. There had been a moment of hesitation, a misstep, perhaps. Miss Pinkerton's death had followed too swiftly for comfort after the package's departure, and if Elspeth had truly sent the manuscript, as was now confirmed by the solicitor's receipt, then she must have thought the danger was over, unless the manuscript she sent wasn't the real one. Miss Marple turned toward the lane that curved behind the old schoolhouse. There she noted the lower kitchen window slightly ajar, and the back gate locked with a padlock that looked newly fitted. A constable still kept watch at the front, but the back garden had been left unguarded. She circled discreetly through the churchyard and approached the house by way of the rear hedge. The study where the typewriter sat was visible through the lower panes. She couldn't enter, of course, not without clearance from Inspector Cray, but she could observe. She lifted her lorgnette and peered through the window's edge. The desk appeared undisturbed. The Remington still stood in the same place, but something caught her eye. A small tear in the carpet beneath the bureau, as if the corner had been shifted and then pushed hastily back. Miss Marple tilted her head. She recalled vividly how pristine that room had looked the day she arrived. Too pristine. A sudden noise behind her made her straighten. It was Florence, her maid, approaching through the alleyway with a brown paper parcel. Miss Marple, I was just bringing this. Delivered to the cottage by mistake, I think. It's addressed to you but bears no return. Miss Marple accepted the package slowly. It was tightly wrapped, but the paper was cheap and the ink smudged. Inside she found a typescript, 30 or more pages, marked Ashwood Revisited, identical to the one sent to the solicitors. But as she skimmed the first page, her eyes narrowed. It was a copy, but something was off. The text was hollow, the phrasing flat, too neat, too rehearsed, gone with the biting asides, the clever psychological notations Miss Pinkerton was known for. This was a forgery, a hurried one. She turned to the final page. No signature, just a line. "To be released in the event of my untimely death." And beneath it, 2 faint indentations, the kind made when someone tears a page from the top of a stack with just a bit too much force. The real manuscript had been removed, hidden or destroyed. Miss Marple looked up slowly, eyes fixed on the old schoolhouse beyond the hedge. Elspeth had posted a copy, a decoy, one designed to placate the legal requirements of the will. But the original, the dangerous version, the one with names, was missing, and someone had made quite sure it stayed that way. The silver typewriter made its reappearance under rather curious circumstances. Inspector Cray had it retrieved from the old schoolhouse study the same evening. Miss Marple received the suspicious manuscript copy. Though it had sat prominently on the desk for days, no one had yet examined it with forensic precision. The initial assumption, reasonable though it was, held that it had been simply a prop, one of Miss Pinkerton's many aesthetic indulgences. It gleamed immaculately, its keys polished to a high sheen, its platen pristine. But the moment Miss Marple suggested that the final line on the page may not have been Lavinia Pinkerton's, Cray agreed it was worth a closer look. The machine was delivered to the local station house, where Cray summoned a typewriter technician from nearby Rye. The man, a hunched fellow named Mr. Purvis, who smelled faintly of pipe smoke and engine oil, worked in silence for nearly an hour, prying open panels, inspecting the type bars, and adjusting the ribbon carriage with narrow brass tools. Miss Marple was permitted to observe from the side of the constable's office, seated neatly in a worn wooden chair, gloved hands folded in her lap. She watched not only the machine but Mr. Purvis himself, noting the way his brows lifted in mild surprise after inspecting the return lever, and again as he removed the platen cover. At last he straightened with a soft grunt. "Well?" asked Inspector Cray, impatient. "It's not right," Purvis muttered. "Not right at all. This machine's been tampered with." Cray raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "For starters, the ribbon is too new, installed very recently, within the last 2 days, I'd say. Fresh spool, minimal ink loss. Nothing you'd expect from a writer deep in composition. And the type bars are inconsistent." "Inconsistent?" Miss Marple echoed gently. "See here." Purvis turned the machine slightly and gestured toward the array of keys. Typewriters, particularly older ones, develop character over time. Keys get sticky, pressure imprints deepen, alignment shifts. This one's been used, but only partially. The top row letters, Q, W, E, R, they're barely worn, but the middle and lower rows, heavy wear, odd patterns, almost as though someone typed the same phrase over and over on a few specific keys. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Could someone have forged a passage?" Purvis shrugged. "They could, and I'd wager they did. What's more, the type. Alignment's been subtly adjusted, to make it resemble someone else's machine, perhaps, or to ensure a particular spacing. But it's crude, sloppy." Cray looked as though a pebble had lodged in his boot. "So the final sentence wasn't typed by her?" "Not unless she learned to type with 3 fingers and no punctuation," Purvis replied bluntly. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes were shining faintly. The deception had been clumsy, but only just. It might have fooled anyone who hadn't spent their life noticing the difference between surface and substance. She stepped forward. "Mr. Purvis, would a person need much technical knowledge to change a ribbon and type a single page?" He chuckled. "Less than it takes to tie a bow. But disguising typing style? That's harder. You can clean a typewriter, but you can't quite erase its habits." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple requested to examine the keys herself. The constables, by now well accustomed to her peculiar brand of insight, obliged. She did not test the machine. She merely ran a gloved finger along the keys, pausing on the letter T, then S, then the space bar. A smear, barely visible. A faint trace of lemon polish, of all things. She didn't need to say the word out loud. She had smelled it before, in Elspeth Pinkerton's sunroom. That evening, Inspector Cray returned to Miss Marple's cottage with an envelope in hand. "I asked for handwriting samples," he said without preamble. "Elspeth, Lane, Beavis, and March. The usual protocols." Miss Marple accepted the pages and spread them on her tea-table beneath the lamplight. The signatures, practice lines, and short dictated passages were written in varying degrees of haste. She studied each carefully, particularly the pressure points and the slope. "Elspeth's has a light touch," she murmured. "More aesthetic than natural, as if conscious of being watched. But Lane, he writes like a man with guilt in his bones. See this hesitation here?" She pointed at the loop in his G. "That's not uncertainty, it's shame." Cray watched her carefully. "But the page in the typewriter wasn't handwritten." "No," Miss Marple said, turning to the final page from the false manuscript. "But this was typed, and quickly. No doubt because the real final page had to be removed, replaced, and plausibly aligned with the narrative. Only someone close to Lavinia, someone who had seen her style, would know what to emulate." She paused. "Elspeth posted a manuscript, but a doctored one. That much is now clear. She must have thought sending it would satisfy the will's conditions, but she likely kept the original, intending to destroy it when she could do so safely. And in the meantime," Cray added, "she typed a page to stage the crime as a collapse during composition." "But she over-rehearsed the lie," Miss Marple said softly. "The real Lavinia didn't write like that. Her rhythms were distinct. She would never have ended a paragraph mid-cadence, nor would she have written something so painfully generic." Inspector Cray exhaled slowly and rubbed his chin. "So we have a motive, money, and now signs of a staged crime. What we still lack is the smoking gun." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I would suggest it is not a gun you require, but a letter opener." Cray blinked. "The vicar's wife's missing brass one?" "Exactly," he frowned. "What's that got to do with the poison?" Miss Marple smiled. "You said earlier there was no residue in the teapot. The missing teacup was never found. And yet the body bore traces of cyanide absorption, particularly around the lips. You assumed ingestion, but what if it was administered another way?" Cray sat up slightly. Miss Marple continued, "The brass letter opener was in Lavinia's study weeks before her death. What if it was used to deliver the poison? Cyanide compounds can be absorbed through mucous membranes in sufficient concentration, particularly if someone were to, say, press it to their lips in thought, or use it to open a letter and then touch their mouth. Writers are creatures of habit. Lavinia had a nervous tic of tapping objects to her lips. "I saw it myself." Cray stood. "So Elspeth laced the handle of the opener, and then conveniently made it." "Vanish," Miss Marple said. "To remove the evidence." The inspector began pacing. "We'll need a search warrant. The house, her luggage, everything." "Not yet," Miss Marple said gently. "Let her feel safe. Let her believe she's fooled us." Cray turned to her. "Why?" "Because she's holding something back," Miss Marple replied. "I believe the real manuscript still exists. And if I'm correct, Lavinia may have hidden it in a place only someone who truly understood her writing would think to look." "And where's that?" Miss Marple lifted her eyes to meet his and gave a small, serene smile. "In plain sight?" "Of course," under the words everyone else ignored. The next morning brought with it a stillness that felt unnatural. Even the birdsong seemed tentative, as though Nether Barrow itself was waiting for something to break the surface of calm. At the old schoolhouse, the constable had been replaced with a detective from County, and Elspeth Pinkerton had remained largely indoors, her movements minimal and her windows drawn despite the fine weather. She had not returned Miss Marple's polite wave the previous afternoon, nor had she appeared at the greengrocer's or the Women's Circle Hall since her aunt's death. She was retreating. Not out of grief, Miss Marple thought, but calculation. Miss Marple, for her part, had risen early. The copy of the manuscript Elspeth had sent still lay on her breakfast table, its pages arranged neatly beneath a ceramic paperweight shaped like a robin. She had read it through 3 times the night before, noting each sentence that sounded too clipped, too safe. There was something missing, not only in tone, but in rhythm. Lavinia Pinkerton had a fondness for pacing her revelations. Even her fiction followed a musicality, 3 slow measures, a sharp turn, then a confession veiled in irony. This version read like a grocery list, but something had caught Miss Marple's eye in the closing pages. A peculiar sequence in the Ye-Wise text that didn't belong. One line in particular slipped between 2 paragraphs of otherwise tepid narrative. "When the ink fades, look beneath the words." It was phrased like a metaphor, perhaps meant to be clever, but to Miss Marple, who had spent decades deciphering both gossip and scripture with equal precision, it did not read as literary at all. It read as a message. She folded the page, placed it in her handbag, and took once more to the village lanes. At the station house, Inspector Cray was pacing, as he often did when decisions pressed in from all sides. The results from the pathologist had confirmed cyanide poisoning beyond all doubt. No digestive traces of food, no remains of tea or liqueur. Skin absorption remained the likeliest explanation. The letter opener, however, was still missing. Miss Marple presented him with the annotated manuscript and pointed out the suspicious line. Cray frowned. "Hidden in plain sight, as you said. What do you suppose she meant?" "I suspect it was literal," Miss Marple replied. "Have you still got the silver typewriter in the evidence room?" Cray blinked. "Of course, along with the page that was in it. Why?" "Because if I were Lavinia," Miss Marple said, "and I feared the pages I wrote might be taken or destroyed, I would not trust hiding them in the obvious places, a drawer, a wardrobe, or even a locked bureau. I would hide them somewhere. No one else would think to look, somewhere visible but ignored." She paused. "May I see the machine again?" They returned to the evidence room, a stark, chilly space with a single window high above the filing cabinets. The silver Remington, Typewriter sat on a steel table under a linen dustcloth, its keys still gleaming from the technician's earlier work. Cray lifted the cloth and Miss Marple leaned in with careful hands. "Do you mind?" she asked. Cray shook his head. "Be my guest." She unhooked the carriage release lever and gently slid the platen to one side. Then, with delicate fingers, she unscrewed the right-hand ribbon spool. The ribbon itself was taut and clean, black and red, slightly glossy. With care she began to unwind it slowly, turning the spool counterclockwise. It took nearly 5 full rotations before something caught, a faint bulge. Something folded beneath the final layer of ribbon, a thickness not caused by the inked fabric itself, but by a foreign object pressed into the coil. Miss Marple stopped turning and carefully pried the object free. It was a slip of onion skin paper, no wider than a tea bag, folded twice and inserted between the ribbon's layers with extraordinary precision. She unfolded it slowly. The page was faintly creased, the ink smudged in one corner, but still legible. It read, "This is the real ending. I do not trust them. If you are reading this, then someone has tried to replace my words. The truth is, with the first chapter, you will find what matters between the lines, beneath the ribbon where the real story lingers." Signed in Lavinia's bold cursive, L. Pinkerton. Cray exhaled a long, slow breath. "Well, I'll be—" Miss Marple smiled softly, eyes still on the page. "I suspect this is only the beginning." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple removed the copy manuscript from under the paperweight and flipped back to Chapter 1. The original had been typed, yes, but certain sentences seemed oddly spaced. She remembered the technician's comment about inconsistent key use. She examined the page under lamplight, squinting. Then she tilted it. There, just barely visible beneath the typed words, were faint impressions, almost like shadows. Miss Marple reached for her embroidery lamp and switched it to its angled daylight setting. The pressure indentations grew clearer. A second text had been imprinted beneath the top layer, an old trick Lavinia must have learned as a wartime secretary. With thin paper and hard pressure, one could type a message that only revealed itself under precise light. She fetched a soft pencil and lightly shaded across the page with the side of the lead. Letter by letter, a hidden message began to appear. The solicitor lied. He changed the terms under threat. Elspeth forged my signature and burned the original. If I vanish, it was murder. She will claim grief, but the poison was hers. It ended there. No flourish, no poetic final line, just cold, flat truth. By dusk, Cray had begun drafting the warrant. Elspeth Pinkerton was placed under discreet surveillance. A team was dispatched to the old schoolhouse to search for the missing brass letter opener and any evidence of forged documents. But it was Miss Marple, ever methodical, who requested one more item be located. "A desk blotter," she said, and the page beneath it. At 8:30, a young constable returned from the study with a thick blotter pad, its corners curled and the last page still attached. Cray peeled it off. More indentations, more names, a list of villagers, timelines. One entry read, "Lane, 3 April. Signed revised will, coerced." Another, "Elspeth, 2 May. Watched me change the ribbon. Removed teacup before constable arrived." Cray looked up. She kept a record. Miss Marple nodded. She suspected they would come for her, so she left a trail not in drawers but in type bars and margins. She was clever, Cray said. She was a writer, Miss Marple corrected, gently. And she knew better than most that the space between the words often says more than the words themselves. Outside the wind was rising, rustling the hedges of Nether Barrow like 1,000 whispered secrets, at last beginning to stir. And in a quiet study behind lace curtains, a silver typewriter had finally told its last tale. It was a strange sort of stillness that settled over Nether Barrow in the wake of discovery. Not the peaceful silence of resolution, but a tense quiet before the final chord, a breath held in collective anticipation. Though the sun shone that morning, its light seemed paler, and the villagers who passed one another on the green did so with careful smiles and unspoken questions in their eyes. The vicar's sermon, delivered with more weight than usual, had left parishioners fidgeting in the pews, and at the Wren and Pheasant the usual chatter had given way to murmured theories about wills, typewriters, and a poison that left no taste. Miss Marple had spent the better part of the morning tending to her rose cuttings and listening to Florence rehash the news from the grocer's in increasingly theatrical tones. "They say she might try to flee," Florence said, placing a saucer down with an emphatic clink. "Elspeth, I mean. Packed a small case, asked for the key to the back garden gate, said she was going to spend a few days with her cousin in Tunbridge Wells. Well, if that isn't suspicious, I don't know what is." Miss Marple simply nodded, brushing a few loose leaves from her lap. "She won't flee," she said mildly. "Not yet." "Why not, miss?" "Because she doesn't believe she's been caught." Florence blinked. "But she has, hasn't she? The inspector's got the notes, the secret message, the whole lot." "Yes, but he hasn't confronted her. And Elspeth, you see, is not an impulsive girl. She's clever. She'll wait to see if the storm passes before making her next move." And Miss Marple was correct. At 3:30, a note arrived at her door, handwritten in Elspeth's delicate, affected script. "Dear Miss Marple, I feel quite unmoored by recent events. Might I trouble you for tea? I value your insight, and I should like to ask your opinion on what I ought to do next. Yours, Elspeth Pinkerton." Miss Marple folded the note neatly and tucked it into her handbag. She requested that Florence prepare the good teapot, the one with the violets, and she arranged for a small tray of lemon scones and seed cake. At precisely 4 o'clock, Elspeth arrived at the cottage dressed in a dark navy coat and soft grey gloves, her posture just a bit too erect, and her smile practised. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice carefully modulated, "thank you for receiving me." "You're most welcome, my dear," Miss Marple replied, ushering her in. "Do sit. The roses are quite beautiful today, if I may say so." Elspeth perched on the edge of the armchair, as if uncertain how long she might stay. "I've been thinking," she began, accepting a cup of tea but not drinking from it, "about what Aunt Lavinia would have wanted, about the manuscript, her legacy." "She was certainly a woman with strong intentions," Miss Marple said mildly, buttering a scone. "Though not always clear ones, wouldn't you say?" Elspeth gave a tight laugh. "Yes, she was fond of her secrets, even with me, especially with me." "Which is odd," Miss Marple mused, "given that you were entrusted with so much." "The new will, the manuscripts, the house." Elspeth's expression faltered just for a second. "She trusted me. Eventually." "Eventually?" Miss Marple asked, tone light. "Well," Elspeth said slowly, "she was reluctant at first. But after the will was signed, I think she understood. I was her only real family. Miss Marple nodded, stirring her tea. You must have been very close. Not always, Elspeth admitted. But in the end, yes, we were close. Miss Marple set down her cup and folded her hands in her lap. It must have been difficult finding her that day, to lose her so suddenly. Yes, Elspeth said, voice almost too quick. It was. I keep replaying it. I can't make sense of it. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. No cup. You. See? No sign of poison in the tea. Just a finished line left on a typewriter, and not even a very good one. Elspeth looked down at her gloves, which she had not removed. You've read the manuscript, haven't you? She asked after a long pause. I have, said Miss Marple gently. Both versions. Elspeth's eyes darted upward. Both? Miss Marple gave her a thin smile. The one you posted, and the real one. Silence followed. A long, dense silence. Then, very softly, Elspeth said, You can't prove which is real. Oh, I think we can, Miss Marple said. Between the letter in the ribbon, the imprint beneath Chapter 1, and the notes recovered from the blotter pad, I'm afraid the trail is quite unmistakable. Elspeth rose slowly, her hands clenched. She had no right to write the truth. She was going to ruin people, destroy reputations, my future. Miss Marple didn't flinch. And so you decided to stop her? Elspeth's voice sharpened. She forced my hand. She left me no choice. It wasn't just about the money, though of course that mattered. It was about how she saw me, a shadow, a supporting character in her little drama. She underestimated you, Miss Marple said calmly. Elspeth laughed, bitterly this time. Everyone does. They see a quiet girl with nice manners. They never notice the clever ones until it's too late. But she noticed, didn't she? She left the ribbon, the note, the trail. She wanted to test me, Elspeth hissed. She said as much, said she was writing something that would see whether I was the person she thought I was. Miss Marple stood. Well, my dear, she said, you've passed that test, just not in the way you hoped. The knock at the door came precisely then. 2 constables, polite but firm, stood with the warrant in hand. Elspeth didn't struggle. She simply straightened her coat and walked out without a word. Miss Marple watched from the doorway as they led her away. The sun was setting now, spilling amber light across the green, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and rain-soaked stone. Florence appeared behind her. She confessed? Not quite, Miss Marple said, but she stopped denying it. And sometimes that's all the truth requires. They returned to the sitting room. The teapot was still warm, the scones untouched. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and gazed out the window. You know, she said softly, some people kill for love, others for greed. But the most dangerous kind, the ones who write their guilt in silence, do it to control the narrative, to be the one who decides how the story ends. Florence, who never quite knew how to respond to such pronouncements, simply nodded and gathered the tray. Outside, Nether Barrow began to breathe. Again. Windows opened, doors creaked. The post office resumed its ordinary hum, and in the quiet of her parlour, Miss Marple added the final stitch to her embroidery, an iris, delicate and blue, blooming from a silver thread. In the days that followed, Elspeth Pinkerton's arrest, a hush descended over Nether Barrow. Not the curious hush that had hovered before the truth had emerged, but a deeper, more settled quiet, as though the village had collectively exhaled. For all the whispers that still flitted through the lanes and hedgerows, there was a reluctant respect among the townsfolk now, an acknowledgment that something dark had happened, and that it had come from among their own. Not a stranger, not a drifter from outside, but someone raised on the same cobbled streets and Sunday sermons as the rest. At the old schoolhouse the windows remained shuttered, and ivy crept further across the sill as if trying to cover the scandal with foliage. Constable Deverell had returned to his regular beat, though now he walked with a touch more solemnity, and, some villagers noted, a bit less bluster. The solicitor, Archibald Lane, had taken an extended visit to his sister in Dorset and the women's. Improvement Circle had postponed their annual luncheon with the excuse of respectful reflection, though Mrs. Gaskell was heard muttering that no one had quite the appetite for vol au vents any more. Miss Marple received visitors more frequently than usual during this strange interlude. Some came under the pretense of returning borrowed sugar bowls or inquiring after rose clippings, but it was always the same, a desire to understand, to make sense of the darkness that had passed through their quiet streets. It was the money, wasn't it? Mrs. Bevis asked one afternoon over a slice of sponge cake. Always is in the end. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her eyes on the lace-curtained window. Money plays its part, certainly, but I've always believed the truest motives are less practical and far more personal. Mrs. Bevis looked puzzled. You mean love? Not exactly, Miss Marple said gently. Not love. Pride, resentment, a hunger to matter in the eyes of someone who never looked your way quite long enough. Elspeth didn't just want Lavinia's estate, she wanted her recognition, and when she couldn't earn it, she seized it. Her tragic thing, really. Word had reached the village that Elspeth had made a partial confession in custody. She admitted to removing the original manuscript, to forging a final page, and to concealing the codicil. But she had denied administering the poison. That detail remained technically unproven, though circumstantial evidence loomed large. Her fingerprints on the ribbon tin. The vanished brass letter opener later discovered, tucked in the base of her travel case, and her undeniable motive. It would be enough, Inspector Cray assured Miss Marple, to see justice done. Still, for all the courtroom talk that would follow, life in Nether Barrow was gradually returning to its old rhythms. The grocer had resumed his morning deliveries. The bell tower had been mended by the carpenter's apprentice, and the village fete, rescheduled for June, was being organized again with tentative optimism. The bunting committee had even reconvened, though the colour scheme had been changed from lavender to sky blue, out of decency. One morning Miss Marple received a small parcel by post. The handwriting on the label was delicate and unfamiliar, and the return address bore the name of Thornbury and Cates, the London solicitors. Inside was a leather-bound volume with a note clipped to the cover. Per Miss Lavinia Pinkerton's final request, this proof is to be forwarded to Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, currently residing in Nether Barrow. It is our privilege to honour her instructions. Miss Marple opened the book carefully. It was titled Ashwood Revisited, The True Notes of a Village Novelist, Lavinia's Final Work, restored to its original form. Miss Marple spent the afternoon reading it in the garden. The story was sharp, intimate, layered with character sketches that clearly reflected real people beneath lightly fictionalized names. There was humor and bitterness, and a depth of understanding that revealed Lavinia had not merely observed Nether Barrow, she had known it, intimately and painfully. Near the final chapter, Miss Marple found this passage. There is an old woman in the village who sees everything and says very little. The world calls her nosy. I call her a sentinel. There's a grace in her silence and a cruelty in her accuracy. If I vanish, it will not be the constable who solves the riddle. It will be the woman who has never needed a magnifying glass to find the truth. Miss Marple folded the book shut and looked at the horizon, where the church steeple cut into the sky like a bookmark in a story still being written. The following Sunday, the pews of St. Mildred's were unusually full. The air inside was warm. The hymnals freshly arranged by young Sarah Parsons, who now moved with a new quiet confidence. Miss Marple arrived just before the bells, as always, and took her seat near the back. She sang with the congregation, bowed her head at the appropriate prayers, and offered a gentle smile to the vicar's wife when they exchanged glances during the reading. After the service, she lingered in the churchyard, watching the townsfolk filter back to their lives. Timothy March had begun writing again. She had seen his new notebook in the bakery window, filled with cryptic scrawlings and bold titles. Mrs. Edgecombe had announced a lecture series on the literary legacy of Lavinia Pinkerton, and even Miss Moffat had taken to hosting modest tea readings of Lavinia's older novels, carefully selecting only the appropriate chapters. It would go on, Miss Marple thought. The village would tuck its scandal into polite corners, much as it had done before, and life would continue. The stories would become half-whispers and softened anecdotes. Names would be protected for the sake of decency. Only the rose bushes and the ivy would remember the truth in full, but Miss Marple would remember too. That evening she sat at her writing desk, not to record a mystery or draft a letter, but to pen a note of her own. It was short, written in her spare, elegant script. 2. Whom it may concern, truth does not sleep. It merely waits, folded between the pages of lives we think we've read. Let the reader beware. In the quietest places, the most extraordinary secrets bloom. She tucked the note into the front cover of Lavinia's final manuscript and placed it on the highest shelf of her modest bookcase, between a weathered copy of Emma and a signed edition of Death in the Vicarage. Outside, dusk fell in soft lavender strokes. A breeze moved gently through the garden, stirring the roses, and in the distance the chimes from St. Mildred's sang their final note for the day. Nether Barrow had returned to silence, but in the heart of the village, Miss Marple knew, silence never truly meant peace, only pause. It was a week after Elspeth Pinkerton's quiet removal from Nether Barrow that the air finally took on the fragrance of early summer. The hedgerows had filled out with lazy green fullness. The lavender bushes had begun to hum with bees, and children's laughter could once again be heard drifting from the far end of the village green, where a worn cricket pitch lay in stubborn disrepair. The season had turned as it always did, and the village in its own rhythm had turned with it. Inside her modest sitting room, Miss Marple sat in the high-backed chair near the bay window, the one Florence always dusted twice, but was never allowed to rearrange. It was the kind of chair in which one felt both grounded and unhurried, where the ticking of the clock seemed not a reminder of hours passing, but an affirmation that life was unfolding precisely as it must. On her lap rested a small lacework square, and Caesar's unfinished cushion cover depicting a lily-of-the-valley sprig. delicately outlined in pale green thread. Beside her, on a tray placed just within reach, a cup of Darjeeling steamed gently, accompanied by 2 oat biscuits and a copy of Ashwood Revisited, now rebound in cloth and ready for its quiet release into the world. Miss Marple was not reading. Nor was she stitching. She was simply looking out of the window, as she often did, and thinking. She had always believed that windows were among the most revealing places in a house. They allowed one to see others, certainly, but more importantly, they allowed others to forget you were there. From that vantage point, life revealed its candid rhythms. A secret meeting between friends by the garden gate, the subtle shift in posture of a woman trying not to appear curious, the way a man paused by a flower shop window when he thought no one was looking, and now from her chair Miss Marple observed the street's slow return to innocence, the baker's boy cycling without haste, the vicar's wife stopping to adjust her hat against the wind, a group of children laughing as they chased a skipping rope's rhythm, all so perfectly ordinary, all so deeply human. She sipped her tea and let the warmth settle. The events surrounding Lavinia Pinkerton's death still echoed softly in the village, of course, though the names were less frequently spoken aloud. Elspeth's absence had been explained by most as an unfortunate departure, brought on by legal misunderstandings, phrases designed more to shield the speaker than the subject. Inspector Cray had taken care to let the press die down quickly, and the manuscript Lavinia had protected so fiercely was now in the hands of her London publisher, its release scheduled for autumn under a modest imprint with quiet discretion. Miss Marple had declined to write a foreword, though the offer had been made. "I do believe," she had said to the editor during a brief telephone conversation, "that Lavinia already said everything she needed to say. My name would only get in the way." And she meant it, for Miss Marple understood something that few people ever did. Truth did not require embellishment. It merely needed time and patience, and the courage of someone willing to see it, even when others were content with shadows. She placed her teacup down and turned to the embroidery, threading the needle slowly. The stem of the lily needed one final curve, the sort of detail that wouldn't be noticed by anyone else, but mattered deeply to her. As she worked the needle through the fabric, her thoughts wandered again, not to the murder, or even to Elspeth, but to Lavinia herself. Lavinia Pinkerton had been a complicated woman, sharp-tongued, proud, sometimes vain, but never malicious. She had understood the village, not just its routines and rituals, but its secrets, its yearnings, and its hypocrisies. Her writing had been dismissed by many as frivolous, but it had always carried within it the pulse of human nature, and in her final act she had used that understanding not to entertain, but to expose, to protect the truth, even when it meant risking everything. It was an irony not lost on Miss Marple that Lavinia's greatest success would come after her death. The needle slipped through the fabric again, smooth and sure. In the kitchen, Florence could be heard humming faintly as she rinsed the teapot. The clock chimed once, 4:30, and a soft breeze stirred the lace curtains, carrying in the distant scent of honeysuckle and rain-dampened stone. Miss Marple paused, set down her embroidery, and allowed herself a rare moment of introspection. What had it all meant? What was the value really in solving another death, in pulling back the curtain on yet another facade? She had no medals to show for it, no books to write, only the knowledge that something buried had been brought into the light, that the Truth, quiet and resilient, had once again refused to be silenced. Perhaps, she thought, that was enough. In a world where so many people walked through life wearing masks, crafting narratives to suit their needs or egos or guilt, perhaps the greatest service one could offer was simply to notice, to observe the contradiction between word and action, to pay attention when no one else did. It did not require brilliance, only care, only patience, only kindness, wrapped in quiet ruthlessness. A knock sounded at the front door. Miss Marple rose with the ease of one who does not hurry. At the threshold stood young Sarah Parsons, holding a bundle of freshly arranged hymn sheets and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "From Mrs. Drayton, miss," Sarah said with a smile. "And this was left at the post. I thought I'd bring it round." "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, taking the items. "Would you care for a biscuit before you go?" Sarah hesitated. "I ought to get back." "But you'd rather stay a moment and sit in the quiet," Miss Marple said gently. "It's quite all right. I understand." And so Sarah did stay just for a little while, perched on the settee with the biscuit in hand, and her eyes wide as Miss Marple told her a gentle story about an entirely different village, long ago, where a church organ had gone mysteriously silent one winter, and how the entire matter turned out to involve nothing more sinister than a squirrel and a stash of stolen walnuts. They laughed, and the breeze danced again through the curtains. As the girl left, the room settled once more into its comfortable stillness. Miss Marple unwrapped the brown paper parcel. It was nothing of importance, just a sample of rose feed, sent by an enthusiastic gardening catalogue, but she smiled nonetheless. Life, in its way, always insisted on continuing. She returned to her chair and picked up the embroidery once more. The lily was nearly complete, and outside Nether Barrow prepared for another day, a day with fewer shadows, perhaps, but never without secrets.